War is a racket. It always has been. Is possibly the oldest, isn't the most profitable, surely the most vicious. That was a quote from Major General Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in American history. You see, this wasn't just the complaint of a disillusioned soldier. It was a warning about a system that has operated in the shadows for over 2 centuries. Now, many of you have probably heard about the military-industrial complex, maybe even about defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. However, there's a good chance you've never heard about the financial mechanism that has funded nearly every major war since Napoleon. And that's exactly how it was designed to work. This secret fund has financed revolutions, orchestrated regime changes, and prolonged conflicts that killed millions of people. Things that impact us to this day. The system was so powerful at one point that wars literally couldn't be fought without its approval. I mean, governments would come begging for money, and a small group of financiers would decide which nations would rise and which would fall. It just goes to show that they knew very early on that money was the thing that made war possible, and that generals and politicians have much less power than they think. You see, while historians focus on battles and treaties, the real story of modern warfare is about cash flow. It's about who funds the armies, who profits from the destruction, and who ensures that conflicts continue just long enough to maximize returns. From financing both sides of the Napoleonic Wars to bankrolling the revolutions that shaped the 20th century, this hidden financial network is undeniably one of the most powerful forces in history. Now, our story begins not with a fund, but with a problem. It's the early 1800s, and warfare is changing dramatically. See, before this period, wars were relatively small affairs. Kings would hire mercenaries, fight a few battles, and then everyone would go home when the money ran out. But the Napoleonic Wars changed everything. Napoleon needed massive armies, hundreds of thousands of men who needed to be fed, clothed, armed, and paid. Traditional royal treasuries couldn't handle this scale of expense, and that's where the opportunity emerged for a new kind of power broker. Not generals, not politicians, bankers. The Rothschild family, as many of you know from our previous video, pioneered this model. But what people do and realize is that they weren't just lending money, they were creating an entirely new financial instrument specifically designed for war. These were called war bonds, and they would become the foundation of modern conflict financing. Here's how it worked. A government would issue bonds, basically IOUs, promising to pay back the money with interest. Banks would buy these bonds at a discount, then sell them to investors. The government got immediate cash to fund their war. So the banks got fees for arranging everything, and the investors got a chance to profit from the outcome. Now look, this might seem straightforward, but the implications were massive. See, suddenly wars weren't limited by how much gold a king had in his treasury. They could go on indefinitely as long as someone was willing to keep buying bonds. Wars became essentially investment opportunities, and here's where it gets really interesting. The same banks that were financing one side would often finance the other side too. I mean, think about that for a second. Both armies shooting at each other were funded by the same financial institutions. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature. By financing both sides, the banks ensured that regardless of who won, they would get paid back. The losing side might be devastated, but they'd still have to honor their debts, and if they couldn't, that's when things got really dark. Because the winning side would be forced to impose harsh terms on the loser to ensure the banks got their money. This is exactly what happened after World War I with Germany, leading directly to the conditions that sparked World War II. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to how this system was really established. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Rothschilds weren't the only players, but they were definitely the most sophisticated. They developed a network of agents across Europe who could move money, information, and gold across borders even during wartime. Nathan Rothschild in London would finance the British war effort. His brother James in Paris would maintain relationships with French officials. Jacob in Frankfurt kept channels open with various German states. This gave them unprecedented intelligence about how the war was actually going. Information they used not just for lending decisions, but for spectacular currency and commodity trades. Now, after Napoleon's defeat, something crucial happened. The victorious powers met at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to redraw the map of Europe. And sitting in the background, advising on the financial arrangements, were the same bankers who had funded the war. They helped structure the reparations, the territorial exchanges, and the ongoing financial relationships between states. This set a pattern that would repeat for the next 2 centuries. Win or lose, the financiers would be at the peace table, ensuring that the post-war order served their interests. It's like being the casino in Las Vegas. The house always wins, regardless of which gambler gets lucky. By the mid-1800s, the system had become highly refined, but also Barings, Hope, and Co., and others had established what was essentially a cartel for war financing. They would coordinate on which governments to support and at what interest rates. If a government tried to shop around for better terms, they'd find that, somehow, mysteriously, all the major banks were offering similar deals. This gave them extraordinary leverage over foreign policy. A government contemplating war would first have to secure financing. If the banks disapproved of the conflict, they could simply refuse to issue bonds. Without funding, the war couldn't happen. So in a very real sense, these private financiers had veto power over military decisions made by sovereign governments. Now, you might think rulers would resent this, and some did. But others realized it was actually quite useful. If you're a monarch or president, being able to blame the markets or the financiers for unpopular decisions is politically convenient. Can't go to war? Blame the banks. To impose harsh terms on an enemy. The banks insisted on it. It was a perfect scapegoat. Northern banks, led by J. Cook, pioneered the mass marketing of war bonds directly to ordinary citizens. For the first time, regular people could invest in war, not just wealthy elites. This was presented as patriotism by bonds to support the troops. But it also meant that huge portions of the population now had a financial stake in the war continuing. If the Union had sued for peace early, those bondholders would have lost money. The economic pressure to keep fighting to achieve total victory became overwhelming. European banks, particularly the Rothschilds, refused to buy Confederate bonds, effectively strangling the South's ability to import weapons and supplies. Now, here's where the story gets really dark. You see, by the late 1800s, the profitability of war financing had become so obvious that banks started to actively encourage conflicts. Not directly, of course. They were far too sophisticated for that. But through their influence over politicians, newspapers, and public opinion, they could nudge countries toward confrontation. Let me give you a specific example. It was a minor issue that could have been resolved diplomatically. But American and British banks had made substantial loans to both governments. And those loans would be more valuable if they were backed by contested territory rich in resources. Suddenly, what should have been a boring boundary negotiation nearly sparked a major international crisis. It was only diffused when cooler heads prevailed. But the pattern had been established. I want to be careful here because this is where we enter controversial territory. There's no evidence of a single conspiracy or master plan. But what is undeniable is that major European banks had strong financial incentives for a large-scale conflict. A major war would provide cover for currency devaluations, debt restructuring, and massive new bond issuances, all of which would be highly profitable for the banks arranging them. A prolonged conflict would generate massive returns on those investments. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, the financial conditions were perfectly set for escalation. But they created an environment where war was financially attractive, and where the resources to wage massive industrialized warfare were readily available. Without the system of war bonds and syndicated loans they had built over the previous century, the war would have been impossible to sustain for more than a few months. Instead, it dragged on for 4 years, killing over 17 million people, and through it all, the bonds kept flowing. Britain borrowed, France borrowed, Germany borrowed. Even the United States, before entering the war, lent enormous sums to the Allied powers. American banks like J.P. Morgan and Co. arranged billions in loans, creating a financial stake that many historians believe influenced America's eventual decision to join the fighting. When the war finally ended, the financial architects were present at Versailles, helping to structure the peace. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations on Germany, 132 billion gold marks. an amount so large that it could never realistically be paid. Why demand the impossible? Because it created a permanent debt relationship. Germany would have to keep borrowing to make reparation payments. Those loans would be arranged by the same international banks, generating fees for decades. It was a self-perpetuating system of financial extraction, all dressed up as justice and accountability. Now you see the consequences of this arrangement almost immediately. The German economy, already devastated by war, was strangled by debt service. Hyperinflation destroyed the savings of the middle class. Political extremism flourished in the chaos. And into this void stepped Adolf Hitler, whose rise to power was directly enabled by the economic conditions created by the post-WWI financial settlement. Here's something that will shock you. Even after Hitler came to power, American and British banks continued to lend to Germany. Companies like IBM, Ford, and others did business with the Nazi regime. Why? Because it was profitable. The moral implications were secondary to the return on investment. I mean, this is the darkest aspect of the war finance system. It's not ideological. It doesn't care about right or wrong. It cares about cash flow and collateral. If you can pay your debts, or at least make it seem like you eventually will, the money keeps flowing. This pattern continued through World War II, though with some modifications. The U.S., having learned from WWI, enacted the Lend-Lease program, which was structured as loans rather than grants. Britain and the Soviet Union received weapons and supplies on credit, creating post-war debts that would ensure American economic dominance for decades. After the war, the entire system was formalized through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These weren't inherently sinister organizations, but they did institutionalize the model that private banks had pioneered. Lending to governments, particularly during crises, with conditions attached that ensured repayment and opened markets to Western financial interests. The Cold War created new opportunities for war financing. The United States and Soviet Union engaged in a decades-long proxy war system, funding insurgents, dictators, and revolutionary movements around the globe, and who arranged much of this financing. The same banking networks that had been doing it for a century, American banks would issue bonds to fund military aid to anti-communist governments. Soviet banks under tighter state control, still connected to the international system, did the same for their allies. Weapons manufacturers got rich. Banks collected fees on every transaction. Millions of people in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East died in conflicts that were, at their core, about spheres of financial influence. Let me give you a specific case study. The Iran-Iraq War of 1982-1988. Both countries were financed by international banks. Iraq received loans from American, French, and Soviet sources. Iran, despite being officially isolated, maintained financial relationships with various European institutions. The war lasted 8 years and killed over 1 million people, but it generated billions in profits for arms dealers and the banks that financed their transactions. Now you might be wondering, is this still happening today? And the answer is absolutely yes, though the mechanisms have evolved. Modern warfare is less about massive armies and more about high-tech weapon systems, private military contractors, and economic sanctions. But the fundamental model, private financial institutions profiting from conflict, remains unchanged. Consider the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on these conflicts. Where did that money come from? Government bonds, largely purchased by domestic and international investors, including major banks. Who made the weapons? Publicly traded defense contractors, who arranged the financing for reconstruction contracts, international banks, and private equity firms. There's now an entire ecosystem of companies that specialize in conflict zone investing. Private equity funds that buy stakes in military contractors. Hedge funds that trade on geopolitical volatility. Investment banks that advise governments on how to structure military procurement. And here's the really insidious part. These financial interests have become so intertwined with government that it's almost impossible to separate them. Former military officers joined the boards of defense companies. Treasury officials moved to investment banks. Bank executives become ambassadors and cabinet secretaries. The revolving door isn't a bug, it's how the system maintains itself. The modern incarnation of war financing has also gone digital. Cryptocurrency has been used to fund various insurgent groups and authoritarian governments avoiding sanctions. Blockchain technology, which was supposed to be transparent and democratic, is being used to move money for military operations without traditional banking oversight. International sanctions, which are supposed to be tools of peace, often have the opposite effect. When the West sanctions a country, that country becomes desperate for alternative financing, which drives it into the arms of less scrupulous lenders who charge higher rates and impose harsher terms. Russia, for example, has deepened financial ties with China and Middle Eastern banks since facing Western sanctions. These new relationships are creating alternative war financing networks outside Western control. Now let's talk about how this system perpetuates itself. You see, once a country goes into debt to finance a war, it enters a cycle that's very hard to escape. The debt requires servicing interest payments that drain the national budget. To make those payments, the government often has to cut social services, which creates internal unrest, which sometimes leads to more conflict, which requires more borrowing. It's a debt trap, essentially. And the countries caught in it often have no choice but to accept whatever conditions the lenders impose. Privatization of state assets, deregulation of markets, austerity programs that hurt ordinary citizens while ensuring bondholders get paid. The IMF and World Bank have been particularly aggressive about imposing these conditions. Using debt as leverage to reshape entire economies, countries that default on war-related debts find themselves frozen out of international markets, unable to borrow for any purpose, which can be economically catastrophic. So governments do whatever it takes to keep the money flowing. They sell off natural resources. They grant concessions to foreign corporations. They impose taxes on their poorest citizens, all to ensure that the investors who funded yesterday's war get their returns today. Now, I should address the obvious question. If this system is so predatory, why hasn't it been stopped? The answer is complicated. First, many people benefit from it. Not just bankers, but pensioners, whose retirement funds are invested in government bonds. Union workers, whose jobs depend on defense contracts. Politicians, whose campaigns are funded by financial sector donations. Second, the system is incredibly complex and opaque. Most people have no idea how war financing works. They see military action on the news, but do unconnect it to the bond markets or commodity trading. The financial mechanisms operate in the background, invisible to ordinary citizens. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the system has been normalized. We accept that wars cost money, accept that governments borrow to fund military operations, accept that private companies profit from defense contracts. These seem like natural features of modern life, not conscious policy choices that benefit a small elite. But they are choices. There's nothing inevitable about private banks financing wars. Governments could fund military operations through taxation or by printing money directly. Would that create other problems? Sure, but it would at least make the costs transparent and put decision-making power in the hands of elected officials rather than bond traders. The alternative model has been tried, actually. During World War II, U.S. government kept interest rates artificially low and pressured banks to buy war bonds at below-market rates. This essentially made bond purchases a form of taxation on the financial sector. It worked. The war was funded without creating a debt crisis. But after the war, the banking lobby fought successfully to ensure that model would never be used again. So here we are in 2025, and the system that emerged in the Napoleonic era is still humming along. The names have changed. We talk about the defense budget instead of war finance, and government securities instead of war bonds. But the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Private financial institutions profit from lending to governments engaged in military operations. Defense contractors, many of which are publicly traded companies, generate returns for shareholders. And the costs, both financial and human, are borne by ordinary people who have no say in the decision-making process. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not everyone involved in this system is evil or even consciously aware of what they're participating in. A portfolio manager buying government bonds for a pension fund isn't trying to perpetuate war. The defense contractor engineer designing weapon systems probably believes they're serving national security. The banker arranging sovereign debt probably thinks they're just doing their job. That's what makes the system so insidious. It doesn't require conspiracy or coordination. It runs on incentives. As long as war is profitable, there will be financial pressure to continue it. As long as conflict creates investment opportunities, there will be capital flowing toward it. The system doesn't need puppet masters. It has institutional logic. But that doesn't mean individuals bear no responsibility. Every banker who arranges war financing, every investor who profits from defense stocks, every politician who votes for military spending knowing it enriches their donors, they all make choices. And those choices have consequences that ripple across the globe. Think about it this way. How many conflicts have continued longer than militarily necessary because ending them would have been financially inconvenient? How many peace deals have been sabotaged because war is more profitable than peace? How many regime changes have been orchestrated not for security reasons, but because a new government would be more willing to open markets and repay debts? We'll never know the full answers to these questions because the system operates in shadows. But we know enough to understand that war is, as General Butler said, a racket. And it's a racket that has made certain people and institutions obscenely wealthy for 2 centuries. What happens next? Well, the system is evolving. Climate change is creating new types of conflicts over water, arable land, and habitable territory. These resource wars are already being financed through the same mechanisms. Banks are issuing green bonds that fund military operations framed as environmental protection. It's the same game with different branding. Artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems are creating new investment opportunities in defense tech. Private equity is pouring into military contractors developing drone swarms and AI targeting systems. These technologies make war cheaper to wage, which means it's more likely to be used as a policy tool. Space is becoming militarized, with nations competing to control orbital territory and lunar resources. Guess who's financing that competition? The same investment banks and defense contractors that have profited from every previous arms race. The system isn't going away. If anything, it's expanding into new domains. So as long as there's profit and conflict, there will be powerful interests working to ensure that conflicts continue. They won't announce this publicly, of course. They'll talk about security threats and national defense and protecting democracy. But underneath all the rhetoric, the logic remains the same. War is profitable. Peace is not. And in a system where profit drives decision-making, that's all that really matters. I'm not naive enough to think that exposing this system will somehow dismantle it. The incentives are too strong, the interests too entrenched. But awareness is still valuable, because once you understand how war financing works, you start asking different questions about military conflicts. When politicians talk about military intervention, ask who's financing it and who profits. When defense budgets increase, ask which companies benefit and who's lobbying for those increases. When sanctions are imposed, ask who bears the cost and who gains leverage. These questions don't have simple answers, but they're the right questions to ask. The secret fund that has manipulated wars for 200 years isn't a single account somewhere. It's a system, a network, a set of relationships and incentives that has become embedded in how modern nations operate. It survives because most people don't know it exists, and those who do benefit from it have every reason to keep it functioning. But you know now, and that's a start. The more people who understand that war isn't just about security or ideology, but also about profit margins and bond yields, the harder it becomes for the system to operate invisibly. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. And this system has operated in darkness for far too long. By the way, if you stayed on till the very end, I'd love it if you could leave an upside-down smile emoji in the comments. I'd love to see how many of you stayed on till the very end. And if you did, I'm very, very grateful. Please don't forget to subscribe to Treasury Tales if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.